Welcome to the Matt Waller Podcast, where we look at success at the intersection of technology, logistics, supply chain, retail, and CPG, also known as the retail value chain. I want to clarify that this podcast is distinct from my responsibilities as a professor in the Sam M. Walton College of Business. Nonetheless, it aligns with my aspiration to provide practical insights to professionals and business by showcasing companies and people that can enhance your ability to manage, lead, and strategize and market effectively in the retail value chain. Before we dive into today's exciting episode, I'd like to thank our sponsor, New Road Capital Partners. New Road invests in proven technologies, services, and products that serve unmet needs in the marketplace. They look for companies in supply chain and logistics, as well as consumer-oriented companies. For more information, go to newroadcp.com. I would also like to disclose that I am a strategic advisor to New Road. I'd also like to recognize podcastvideos.com for the services they provide for these podcasts. I'm very pleased with their services. And now, without further ado, let's get into the exciting episode. I have a really exciting podcast episode for you today. Today, I'm interviewing Tracy Rosser. When you look at his background, it's quite remarkable. When you look at the topics we're going to cover in this recording, it's definitely worth listening to. If you're involved in transportation, any area of logistics or supply chain management, or if you're in consumer packaged goods or retail, I think you probably need to listen to this. It's pretty remarkable. I mean, Tracy's got a really strong background. He was with Walmart for over 22 years, and he eventually was Senior Vice President of Transportation Supply Chain. But he's got all kinds of experience. He's got experience in the store operations area and distribution centers, in transportation, in many, many different areas of Walmart. But even outside of Walmart, he's on the board of Covenant, a truckload provider. He's on the board of, he's working with all kinds of high-tech types of companies through his work with a private equity firm, New Road Capital Partners, which is the founding sponsor of this podcast. But he really has a deep knowledge. There's a lot of people you can talk to that may have had a lot of experience, but he not only has experience, he's got a very strategic mind, and you'll see that as you listen to this podcast. In the podcast, we talk about some really interesting topics, including really important topics. On the one hand, how do you build resilience into your supply chain? And he even recommends a book as we're talking about that, a couple of books. And that's something we do need to be considering. I mean, our society needs to be considering it, but certainly individual companies need to be contemplating it. And he explains it in really simple terms, and I think that's worth knowing. The other thing he talks about that I really found interesting was, how do you measure the impact of data analytics and real-time information? How do you measure the impact of that on logistics operations? I think, certainly high-tech companies that are building technology to provide that need to understand that. It's worth thinking through carefully. We even talk about things like, what's the value of a private fleet? Should you have a private fleet? If you do have a private fleet, what's the benefit of a private fleet? It's a wide-ranging discussion, but I think you'll find it very interesting. Tracy, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me here.
Tracy, I'd love to know, and you've had so much experience, how have you seen customer service expectations influencing supply chain strategies over time? And what do you recommend really to deal with these evolving demands?
Boy, it's a good question. And it's something that, Matt, it is changing so fast. It's like whenever you talk about supply chain, you think about the pace of change and rate of change. And I was just having a conversation with somebody this week about this very thing, and we were talking about supply chain design. And I'm like, okay, in my mind, everything starts with the customer and what a company's promise is.
I've heard you say that a lot.
Yeah, and I got a really good appreciation for that because I had the opportunity to not only be in supply chain but store operations and be with the customer a lot. And so I think it really starts around what your promise is to the customer and what the customer expectations are of you based on your promise, and that you have to have a supply chain that's designed to fit and execute against what that promise is. And so given that and how a customer's expectations influence supply chain design, I'll tell you today it's technologically driven and it's price driven. I think it kind of depends on, and all customers are not homogeneous, but it's really interesting. So I think about, customers think a lot about value and they think about their time and their convenience. And so when you're designing a supply chain, you got to really think about what am I delivering to a particular customer in terms of how you design it. And these things, it was funny, we just said, let's put our cell phones down and I'm already picking it up. These things are changing the world around supply chain design and the complexity of supply chain design and how you deliver to a customer now who's becoming or who has the thought process of, I want merchandise or groceries or items delivered to me when I want them, where I want them, but also at the price I want it. And so everything kind of has to fit. And it can be different for the same customer based on the circumstance that the customer's in that day. And so you have to, if you're going to promise to meet a customer where they are and when they want it, you have to have a supply chain design that actually can execute against that. And therein lies the complexity of supply chain design today. So I think it goes back to, what your promise is, and then that can influence, what your supply chain design is. So I know that's kind of pretty high level, but boy, the world's gotten a lot more complex around it.
It is high level, but it's actually important to think of it from a high level. I mean, you're talking about omnichannel supply chain management. The people can order so many different ways. They can buy online, pick up at store. They can buy online, pick up at store, and still go into the store for some things.
Right.
They can go into the store and showroom and buy something online from another retailer even, or through another channel. And it's interesting. I have a friend who's building a house right now, and he's building this little kind of like closet next to his garage where someone told me about this, and then I actually met someone that was doing it, where they put a refrigerator in there.
Right.
So you have a code on the outside that the delivery person can come in and put the food in the refrigerator and the other dry groceries in the cabinet, and then there's another door from the garage into there. Apparently this is becoming quite popular now. Have you heard of that?
I actually have. There's people that are looking, and it's kind of a blast back to the past. And sometimes history repeats itself.
Like Milkman.
Like the Milkman, or back in the day when you had this cooler on homes, getting blocks of ice delivered to your home.
Oh, yeah.
It was delivered from the outside into the cooler, and you would open up the inside of the cooler and get your blocks of ice. So it's kind of a little bit of a revisit to the past and the Milkman to a cooler out front or to your front doorstep.
But it is funny, you're right. Your customer, you can have one customer with different expectations by channel. And that makes the supply chain design even more complicated, I would think.
Right. And so if your mission is, and this is where, I was at Walmart for quite a while, and I think about the complexities that retailers are dealing with today about meeting customers where they are when they want it. And that's what Walmart wants to do, and also do it at the right price. Because if the price isn't right, that could be a deal breaker as well. And so having inventory, having the dots on the map and the channel decision, the optimization, what I would call having the digital supply chain fully enabled to execute against that is so critical and so complex. And so, when you think about digital supply chain, I took a couple of notes here. I think about always on, highly connected. Everybody in the supply chain's connected. You've got integrated optimization, real-time optimization based on where you put your inventory. You've got transparency, end-to-end transparency and visibility to your inventory. But think about those things being on 24 hours a day and executing 24 hours a day to a demand signal. And then you've got to make decisions across all of that information in the entire network. And then I think one of the things that I'm not hearing enough about digital supply chains are once the supply chain is executed, are you getting insights on how the supply chain actually performed, so that you can, if you need to do something different, you can respond very quickly and execute differently. So anyway, it's just a far complex world. But back to your question, customer expectations are driving everything.
Yeah, and something this reminds me of is the marketing aspects affect all this as well. They affect the expectations, they affect the demand. And I was just thinking about, retail media networks are becoming a big deal now. And some research we did at the university, we found that there were over 600 retail media networks right now. 600.
Wow.
So, if you're a supplier, you have to decide, how much money do I take from traditional media and put it into retail media networks? And then, or even if it's incremental revenue money, how do you divide it up amongst those retail media networks? And then within a given retail media network, how much do you put into the app versus the website? Do you want a sponsor page? Do you want a brand page? All these questions, but they all affect demand. And even at the check stand, with the self-check, you see these ads on there all the time, which is part of the retail media network. And I know one of the companies you and I know about, M4, they actually are they give you the ability as a supplier or retailer to be able to look, like, how long if someone was in the store, did they shop other stores, other retailers? How long were they in the store? How long were they on the website? What did they do on the website before they came to the store, et cetera, et cetera? I didn't even know something like that existed.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of complexity, and then there's a lot of technology that can make the complexity a little bit easier to deal with. But
yeah, and then Matt, it's interesting. So earlier this week, Procter & Gamble released earnings, and I was listening to their CEO talk about how they drove earnings, and so for some strange reason, I got on the Walmart app, and I got on the Amazon app, and I got on Kroger's app, and I just looked up Tide if I want to buy a box, or a container of Tide. And it's amazing. I was putting myself in Procter & Gamble's shoes after I went through that process on the incredible assortment that just exists in Tide, that one brand of pack sizes, scents, things of that nature, and what a Kroger or Walmart or Amazon leads with on their site. It's amazing in what that's doing to the supplier, the CPG community, in terms of complexity in their supply chain. To better position yourself as a retailer on those sites, it's really just mind-boggling.
it really is. I'm always surprised. So I've done that too. I've looked at lots of different websites, lots of different SKUs within a brand, across brands, and it always surprises me too how I sometimes think these brands don't put enough attention to the text they use, on the websites or
Right.
Or the picture, or even the price. It seems like all of this. It seems like there's an opportunity there for a lot of even big suppliers to do a better job.
Yeah.
But then tying that into the supply chain makes it really complicated.
Right.
But I do want to move on to a different topic, a little bit related. I remember when Katrina happened. Of course, you do too.
Remember well.
But that was the first time I had seen supply chain resiliency be so important. And I remember Walmart's response was noteworthy. It made the news because federal agencies couldn't respond as well as Walmart did to Katrina. Walmart even created things that had never existed before, like the ability to they drove trucks down there that were like mobile pharmacies, and they had pharmacists in Bentonville filling prescriptions to these poor people that didn't have access to pharmacies. Probably saved a lot of lives. And all kinds of things like this happened during Katrina. And it kind of interested me, so I read a bunch of articles and talked to people at Walmart about it. But since then, so many other things have happened in the supply chain that make it very complicated, including recently, not only COVID, but even the Red Sea challenge, right?
Yeah, it's happening now in Panama Canal.
Panama Canal, absolutely. And it seems like it's one thing after another. But, I think these companies are trying to build resiliency into their supply chain. If you Google resilient supply chain, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about it. But I'd love to know, what lessons have you learned over the years about building resilience into the supply chain?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of things that come to mind when you bring Katrina up and other things that happen in the supply chain or to businesses from a resiliency perspective, Matt. So I think about I like to read, and Yossi Sheffi. I don't know if you know.
Oh yeah,
remember Yossi. So he wrote a book on resiliency,
yes,
which was a pretty good book. But I don't know if he's written one since then, because the world's changed a lot since he wrote one. And you think about cybersecurity and things of that nature that are in play today that weren't in play when he wrote that book. And I'm reading a book now from Stanley McChrystal. And so it's called Risk. And so it's a pretty interesting book. And so he talks about the fact that that you have to control what you control, and reducing risk starts with leadership. And so, and it's a really good read. I'm about halfway into it. But he talks about what do you need to prepare for, and how do you need to think about risk from a mathematical perspective. And it's, threat times vulnerability equals risk. And then he talks about, graphing it out of probability and consequences in your business. And so it just gets you thinking a lot about kind of how you prepare for things. And I think about COVID, and at the start of the book, it talks about the world of COVID. But, I think about the things that you were talking to, and I think about the times that we're in today, and people are taking a breath today, and they're going, except for the Red Sea and the Panama Canal issues. And everybody's taking a breath, and they're saying, okay, we're back to normal. And the risk of being back to normal is you forget about what you just came out of. You're not thinking about risk and preparing for what's next. And so the biggest thing that I would say that I've learned about risk is when you don't have to think about risk and the world is, quote, normal, is when you ought to be doing something about it. And so I see too many organizations go to sleep, and they live kind of in the moment, and they don't think about their experiences, and they don't think about the risk to the organization operationally, and they don't think about their supplier base. They don't think about how to build resiliency, redundancy. We were talking about Mike Duke earlier, and I remember Mike talking about having an appropriate amount of slack in the Walmart supply chain. So not to the point where you're inefficient, but having the appropriate amount of slack so that you can efficiently flex up when you need to. And so those are the types of things I think about risk. It was so funny. We were just having a conversation. You did a great interview with Chris Caplis, and we were talking about, or y'all were talking about elephants and goldfish kind of live in the moment. And you were talking about, how do I think it was the truckload sector. And I was thinking about that, and it's like we've got to be dolphins. And dolphins, if you look up that, it actually got me interested. I looked up, okay, what are the most intelligent species of animals out there? And I was surprised. Crows and ravens and ants came up, and then dolphins. And I'm like, okay, let's talk dolphins. That sounds better than a crow or a raven or an ant. And so I think about being really wise and strategic about how we assess risk based on our learnings and doing something about it in an intelligent way when times are good. And so, and it's internal, it's cultural as well within organizations. So anyway, I could go on and on about how I think about risk, and how you have to look at what your biggest vulnerabilities are as an organization, and then figure out how you work that into your strategic plans, so you're not doing something at the last moment out of just pure necessity.
Well, it's interesting because when you think about the fact that we had COVID, a pandemic. People have been saying a pandemic is going to happen for a long time, and it finally happened on a massive scale. Now, where it came from is certainly a question. But there is always the risk that we're going to have another pandemic. There's the risk of problems with our electric grid.
Mm-hmm.
People focus on risks like nuclear war or something, and they're certainly there, but there's a lot of other risks that could happen. It could be almost as devastating. But even on the scale, right, there's all kinds of degrees of how bad things might get, like, say, an attack on the grid or another pandemic, or other kinds of problems. I still think even now there probably isn't enough effort in companies and by the government to focus on how do we prepare for this. We know the grid's an issue, and it feels like nothing's happening to protect the grid. And companies can only do so much to protect their assets and their business if the grid has a major problem.
Yeah. I'll tell you, Mike, or not Mike, I'm sorry, Matt. During my career, I can really vividly and tangibly recall one time where I was like, oh boy, this could be the worst thing that could ever happen. And it was when the Colonial Pipeline was shut down.
Oh yeah.
And there was a lot of uncertainty about fuel supply. And that was one of the only times I sat there and wondered, what on earth are we going to do if both major pipelines shut down? And so it would totally mobilize us, and it's not something that we've planned and prepared for if that ever occurred. But to your point, you can learn from your past, and then you can take a look forward and actually learn from what others have gone through. And then have a risk program in your organization, where you detect and assess, and then you actually, go through exercises and model, hey, let's imagine that this is taking place, and have a plan in place. And again, you have to pick and choose. But for supply chain, I think about things like we were talking about, like having the appropriate slack, having the right partnerships, the strategic relationships with your suppliers and your vendors. All those types of things are so important, and have diversification and flexibility and adaptability.
Well, I even think channel diversification can help. If you think about it, I know Walmart didn't create buy online, pick up at store, thinking a pandemic might occur. But because they had it, it was a huge benefit. Huge benefit. And a lot of the competition thought it was silly.
Yep. They got 15 years of work done in two of innovation.
Boy, that is so true. By the way, I looked up. You mentioned earlier the interview that I did with Chris Kaplis, and that was published a little over a week ago. So it was about the week of the 20th of January for those who might be interested, and that was a really interesting conversation. We can talk a little bit more about that later. But the other thing I wanted to point out is you mentioned this book by General Stanley McChrystal. It's called Risk, a User's Guide. I just like to repeat some of those things so people can look it up. And I noticed that, it's got really high ratings, over 400 ratings that are incredibly high. I've not read that, but now that you've said it, I'm going to. I read Team of Teams. I don't know if you read that one.
It's sitting on the bookshelf and needs to be cracked open.
It's a great. I really liked it. I don't know. It's certainly well known, but anyway. Well, one of the things I've been wanting to ask you a little bit about is when we started talking a little bit about technologies and how important they are, but what are some of the technologies that you see emerging, or even methodologies, that you think is really going to shape the future of logistics management?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Matt, I'm going to give you another plug for another podcast that I listened to that was really good. We kind of work with a gentleman by the name of Joshjitt. Josh is just a great mind.
He is.
Technological mind and thought leader. And so the podcast that you did with him was outstanding. And he touches on this in a little bit different way. But I think what's happening... So by doing some of the work with New Road Capital Partners, which I'm an advisor there, I'm seeing earlier stage companies that are, I think, really acutely listening to customers and that are really seeking out and trying to have their fingers on the pulse of real business problems that exist. And they're developing capabilities, utilizing technology. First of all, the thing they're doing is listening, and they're being very aware of what's happening in the market. And then they're doing something about it. And I think about companies that are using technology and developing new capabilities that existing technologies they're just either gapped or they're slow or they're not connected. And so, and I'm going to just throw some random companies out that come to mind where I see people making advancements and using the digital world that we talked about earlier in terms of a digital supply chain. Some of those thought processes are very true, I think, in some of these emerging companies that are utilizing technology. I think about what's happening with Jeff Silver and Mastery and what he's doing with the operating platforms for motor carriers and brokers. There's a company called WorkStep that's doing great things utilizing technology for employee retention, but they're using the collection of data, being connected to employees to do things differently. There's companies that are taking a look at safety areas and risk areas based on the collection of information and trying to solve problems there. So I see people using technology, and then it's speed, and then it's insights for management action. And so those are the types of companies that I'm seeing emerge in different sectors that are starting to make a name for themselves, where the legacy companies either aren't there, it's difficult for them to change, or it's expensive for them to change, or they just don't want to. And so that's leaving some room open for a lot of emergence in terms of people who are really technology forward and trying to solve problems. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
It's kind of a glimmer into what I'm seeing in terms of a common thread across a lot of these companies that have really interesting solutions to problems where legacy technologies exist today, but they can just be better.
You know, you mentioned WorkStep, and that is an interesting company because, you know, what they have a technology that allows you to really get the pulse of the frontline workers and to close the loop on it,
Right.
and to measure the effect of closing the loop on it. And it's very hard to do, even with online survey tools. They're just hard to really manage the whole process. I remember when I first learned about WorkStep, I thought, you would think this would have been created 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
Right.
I mean, it could have been. I'm not sure why it hadn't been. It's probably more advanced now because they're using AI and things like that. But it's such a basic thing, really understanding employee satisfaction and then being able to let them speak to their mind about it and then doing something about it and following up. I mean, these are just basic management techniques, but it's enabled by a tool that makes it real easy. But the other one that came to mind when you were mentioning that just popped into my mind was Shiftboard. You know, they've got this frontline worker shift, because shift work is so challenging.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, some people are staying up all night and life is difficult. And, you know, it's hard to say, okay, well, I'm going to sleep during the day when some things have to be done during the day. But Shiftboard allows workers to, and it will take into account union rules and company rules and fatigue and all this. But, you know, if you've got a shift that I want, I can trade with you using Shiftboard without getting a bunch of people involved. And the system will say, can they do that or can't they do that?
Right.
Or maybe I need more overtime. I say, hey, Tracy, I'd be willing to work some for you. I really need some overtime. But the system's got all this built in so that people don't violate rules that the company set up or safety rules or legal parameters, et cetera, et cetera. But again, you know, I think what really has driven all of these kind of technologies to be adopted now is COVID to a degree.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that.
Because, you know, it's like people are losing great shift workers, and we all depend on shift workers for everything we buy at the store. But it is encouraging. I know that's people sometimes might not think, oh, that's a supply chain technology, but really it is, because the supply chain's run by, there's so much of it that's run by shift workers. More than, I mean, it's easy to be, say, a banker and to do your life and not realize the nitty-gritty, the difficulty of what has to occur to get groceries to the store. The whole process from beginning to end is just remarkable, you know. Well, shifting gears a little bit, you know, based on your tenure in the industry, what are some key factors you see that are really important in maintaining a reliable and effective transportation network, especially for large-scale operations?
Oh, it's such a good question. So I have spent most of my career in transportation, and one of the things that I think, I'll probably have the tendency to go back to your capless.
Yeah, that's fine.
A little bit here on this one because it was so well done and the topic was great. So at scale, and what I can speak to is personal experience. And so at Walmart, you know, we knew when I first started in transportation there that, you know, the company had a growth plan. And we knew that we were going to stamp out X number of super centers per year, X number of distribution centers a year. We knew over 5 years what type of demand we were going to have. And we knew that the carrier base and how we did business was not going to support what the future required.
Right.
And so we had to be very thoughtful around the portfolio. We were very transactional at the time. And you could not run that future business in a transactional way and have a reliable, resilient transportation network. And so the first thing starts, again, with a sound strategy around what you want to be and your promise to your customer. And then what we did is, and the thing that was right for Walmart is we had the private fleet, and we wanted to appropriately deploy the private fleet. And then we had, as it relates to our purchase transportation, we had incredibly deliberate conversations at the CEO level, COO level, with motor carriers, and said, here's what we think we're going to need in the future. Where does it make sense for you to play? What levels can you participate at? What technology do we need? What investments do we need you to make as a carrier to support us? And so we had a lot of really thoughtfully guided conversations. And so I think in building a network that functions at scale, for us at the time, that worked well. And we got the service that we needed. I think we got the value because we were very explicit in how we wanted to position ourselves relative to, how we should fit a carrier's portfolio, and that we felt that we would have enough volume that you can utilize us as your base of volume and then build on it, build your network on top of ours, on top of the business you were doing. And we'll be the type of customer that pays your light bills and your payroll, and we'll enable you to go do other things and make greater margin in other areas. And that was kind of the thought process. And I spent 9 years in the truckload business prior to that, so I kind of had that in mind as we were building it. But having the right partners that can actually execute the way you want them to execute, and that will work with you to find areas of operating inefficiencies so you can eliminate waste together, are great partners. And then in times of like a Katrina, or in times of need from a resiliency standpoint, you had carriers that would then do things with you when you really needed them, that were strategic partners that could help serve your business. And then when there was downtime, you look for ways to help those carriers as well, because you need them in the future. And so that was kind of how we thought about operating it at scale, and then building, again, just focused on efficiency and service together, and sharing data and being open to sharing information and data. So you could collectively, again, if you're driving cost out in the network for the carriers, you hope that you get that back. You actually have a discussion that you want a portion of that back, and vice versa. So anyway, that's kind of how we thought about it at scale. But again, the appropriate mix and balance was all very, very important.
Well, Tracy, you now are engaged in evaluating, helping, working with, et cetera, high-tech companies in the area of supply chain management and retail technology, marketing technology, these things. And of course, you help these companies, you work with them in your role. But how do you assess the impact of data analytics and real-time information on decision processes in supply chain management? The reason I ask that is when I look at a lot of these companies, a big component of the supply chain technology that's emerging now is really around data analytics or real-time information. It's something there.
Sure is.
And so how do you assess the impact of that on decision-making?
Boy, it's a really good question. And I think it goes back to, I see some really interesting companies right now, and really kind of blessed to see some of these companies that are solving problems. As I assess, you've got companies that are using data And what they're doing is they're really drawing upon a lot of what I would call highly just disparate, fragmented data that lives in different places in the industry. There's a great little company called Highway out of Dallas, Texas, and they're involved in helping prevent fraud in the brokerage space, in making sure that a carrier is legitimate. And they're pulling data from so many different places and triangulating it to determine the level of risk of fraudulent behavior that a carrier or shipper may be exposed to. Really, really cool. But what they're doing is they're solving a real problem with real-time data, because the way the fraudulent activity is working in that space, it moves very fast, that somebody can create something that could be and engage in your business in a fraudulent way. And then I think about, so when I was at Transplace, we invested a lot in data and analytics. And so during COVID, it became hugely important to look at, for our customers that we were controlling their networks, to take their TMS data and be able to show them today or tomorrow what's happening in their network. Yesterday and the couple of days before, how much are they shipping out of alignment? How are they utilizing Q in their networks? And so that they can make a better decision tomorrow. But I think the linkage, and this is probably redundant to what I've said earlier in our discussions, taking the linkage of real-time data and converting it to insights that are useful management insights that are focused on value, on real value, is happening today. And those companies that are figuring that out are going to do really well, where they can use real-time data, real-time information to see what's happening in the business and convert it to something you can then go make decisions on. So that's really what excites me in the future. And I'm seeing more and more people that are really putting a lot of thought into those types of solutions.
So, Tracy, now when you look at transportation in the United States, there's so many different types of transportation. You've got trucking, you've got pipelines, you've got rail, you've got inland water,
which is the Mississippi River, and all that's an issue today as well.
Air. There's just and then within trucking, you've got truckload trucking and private fleet truckload trucking, which is about $800 billion combined. LTL, final mile type stuff. There's just drayage. There's so much going on. And it's interesting, before deregulation, things weren't so, no one knew exactly how things would change. But of course, if you look at the percentage of our GDP that goes to trucking, it's decreased dramatically, even though the size of it's grown dramatically, because it's become so efficient, it's mind-boggling. The market has it created the difference between LTL and truckload, for example. But, if you look at truckload and LTL, you've got LTL is a concentrated industry because there are barriers to entry, high barriers to entry. Whereas in truckload trucking, barriers to entry are low. There's a lot of players, very few big players.
Right.
But then you've got private fleets. And so I'd love to know, what you think about private fleets. Like, what is the role of private fleet operations in today's supply chain ecosystem?
So funny, the conversations that we're having, and you think about, I was just speaking with somebody about this yesterday.
Is that right?
Totally. And we were talking about the advantages of having a private fleet, because the person knew a little bit about my background, and we were just having the conversation very quickly about it. And you've probably got some COVID hangover a bit with the thought process on private fleets, because people that probably didn't think about having a private fleet or didn't think about dedicated contract carriage. Prior to COVID, started thinking a lot about it during COVID because of the control that you have and the control around execution and service and the visibility you have to cost. And so when I think about private fleet, those are the types of things that come to mind. Now, I may have an inherent natural bias to private fleet because of my days at Walmart. And it was one of the most pleasurable pieces of what I did was having responsibility for supporting the private fleet for a few years. But the things that I loved about it is we had it pointed to some of the most critical components of our supply chain. So the value of having product on your shelves at a Walmart store is really high. The value of an out of stock, so the opportunity cost is extremely high. And so the private fleet enabled us to execute day in, day out at a very high level, and we controlled the execution. There was nobody else to blame other than ourselves if we didn't execute on the movement of product from DC to store in the general merchandise network and the ambient network. Now, we did choose, and I was telling you I had projects when I first started at Walmart. Didn't have a job, but I had projects. One of my very first projects, I had 3 projects. This was the second one. Myself and another gentleman had to go present to the head of the specialty division at the time, who was Rollin Ford, and we had to determine, were we going to outsource the movement of groceries in the temperature-controlled segment, or were we going to do it ourselves? And so we put together this analysis, and we said we can save $38 million. This was in like 1997, that we can save $38 million if we go do it ourselves. And I still remember we had it on a floppy disk. And,
and some people won't know what that is.
That's right. Some people
this.
will not know what it is. And we chose not to. But we decided to grow the private fleet, and then we decided to outsource to dedicated carriage on the temperature control. And then we decided that we wanted a degree of flexibility, and so we said, we'll go buy the trailers, and then we'll outsource the power. And so that was kind of the happy medium that we came up with on the grocery DC to outbound. But where you want to control cost, where you want to control the execution and the service, and where you can do it, you still have to be able to do it efficiently. And the beautiful thing about Walmart is we had a dense enough network where we could, once that tractor was deployed at a store and had a store delivery, if you looked regionally and you wanted to operate that truck in a regional nature, there was enough volume that you could run a network and run a very competitive movement of freight across the network of moving backhauls, so connecting inbound freight to the outbound moves where it made a lot of sense. And then you obviously you have safeties first and foremost. If you're going to be in the private fleet business, you have to have a very strong bias culturally to safety. And if you don't, I would say don't get in the private fleet business. That would be the first blush. But anyway, so I'm a proponent of private fleets where it makes sense to deploy them. I'm also a proponent of what I say could be the hybrid. If you don't want to deploy the capital to that piece of the business, find great carrier partners that are really good at running dedicated operations with a longer term agreement. And we're a customer or a provider that will really understand and get in deep with you and understand what your customer requirements are and what your strategies are, who can actually then be that extension of your company in a dedicated kind of closed loop environment. So that, Matt, I don't know if that hit on what you were looking for, but that's kind of how I think about private fleets.
No, it does. I
will tell you one other thing.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Let me interject this real quick. The other value that was a very interesting value in private fleet, if you're a purchaser of transportation, you know what tires cost, you know what fuel costs, you know what a driver costs, you know what a truck costs, you know what a trailer costs, you know what parts cost, you know what maintenance costs are. And so it helps you when you're negotiating with motor carriers and you're still buying billions of dollars or millions of dollars with motor carrier. It helps the internal conversation around, when a motor carrier says, hey, my truck costs more, my tires are costing more, my trailer's costing more. Here's what's happening from an insurance standpoint. You know what's real and what's not. And so it just enables that conversation in positive ways. And then in ways when somebody's coming to you asking for money that you know that there's a better way and you can collaborate on better ways. So anyway, it helps that side of the conversation as well, which is it's soft dollars, and but they're very healthy, good conversations to have the data to sit on to have those discussions.
Information's so valuable. Really, what you're saying is part of the benefit of having some private fleet is the knowledge you get and the visibility, the information you have for everything else you're doing. And I know that's really been one of the tenets of Walmart for a long time. I know, of course, early on, Sam Walton was really big on communicating with store managers and department managers. He wanted them to know where they were making money, where they weren't. He was very open. Uh-huh. It was kind of unusual to be as open as he was. Some people didn't even think it was a good idea, but he knew it worked. But I remember reading, I think it was 1968. People may not know this. He figured as they were expanding, he realized we're going to at some point have to use computers to do this. And so he took a course at IBM in 1968 about computer programming and computer systems. And he felt, I need to understand this. And of course, and then several years later, they realized as they were expanding, I think they had bought the Big K stores.
Tennessee.
I can't remember how many stores that was, but it really pushed their ability to communicate.
Right.
And so they partnered with a company to create a satellite system to communicate with the stores and the distribution centers. Again, that had never been done before. But so you see, what we've been talking about, is all kinds of real-time information, actually having certain kinds of operations to give you information that may inform other things you're doing that are unrelated to that operation, and then sharing that information. And some of these companies are creating technologies to facilitate that. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and the thing that we didn't talk about, the private fleet, kind of looping all the way back to the very first topic we had, the Walmart network today is vastly different than the Walmart network I left 4.5 years ago. And when I think about having a responsive tool at your hand, like the Walmart private fleet, to execute in a highly dynamic environment, if you've got inventory deployed in various places, and your channels are dynamic to fulfill a customer promise, the ability to have dynamic optimization and then the control of a private fleet to execute upon that or to participate in that at some level could be very, very valuable and give you a competitive advantage. And so anyway, it does there's application for it as you think about how to execute an omnichannel network that's as complex as what a Walmart has.
Well, Tracy, thank you so much for visiting with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you're finding value in this podcast, we greatly appreciate your support by subscribing to our YouTube channel. Additionally, following us on Apple and Spotify and leaving up to a 5-star review would be immensely helpful. We welcome any feedback or questions related to the podcast, as well as suggestions for further topics and guests. You can leave your comments on our YouTube channel, and rest assured that I will read each and every one of them. Please also take a moment to check out our podcast sponsors, as they play a critical role in keeping this podcast running. For more information on specific topics, timestamps, or links to articles mentioned during the podcast, head over to mattwallerpodcast.com.